Okay, so let's do a little bit of orientation with this diagram. It looks fairly complex. So in this rectangle here, this is a muscle cell. Okay, the muscle cell is surrounded by a capillary, the smallest blood vessel in the body. Feeding into the capillary is the respiratory system and the digestive system. So let's just take this from the top up here. So here we have a bronchiole surrounded by smooth muscle, which is loose. And here we have alveoli. Because there's a high concentration of oxygen in the alveoli and a low concentration of oxygen in the capillary, the oxygen will diffuse from high to low concentration down its concentration gradient using simple diffusion. Okay? Now, over here, we have the digestive system. So here's the esophagus, here's the stomach, and here's the small intestine. So if we take in complex carbs, for example, pasta, those get broken down mechanically in the stomach, but not chemically. There are enzymes that are in your small intestine that will break it down chemically. And complex carbs get broken down or catabolized into simple carbs. For this example, we're going to use glucose. So we're not going to explain how the glucose gets from your intestines into the capillaries. That'll be for another video. But glucose goes into your capillaries, right? So now we've got oxygen and glucose in your capillaries. And both the oxygen and glucose need to get into this muscle cell in order to perform cellular respiration. So it's easy for the oxygen to diffuse out of the capillary and into the muscle cell because oxygen goes through simple diffusion from a high concentration to low concentration right through that thin layer of single cells called simple squamous. However, glucose cannot easily diffuse from high to low concentration. It needs a helper protein. Because glucose is C6H12O6, it's a rather large molecule, it needs to go through facilitated diffusion. So in order to get from the capillaries into the cell, it needs a helper molecule. And that helper molecule happens to be the hormone insulin. So if we have the hormone insulin, glucose can then be brought into the cell, and if we look at glucose like a $10 bill, we need to split that $10 bill into two fives, which are called pyruvate or pyruvic acid, through a procedure called glycolysis. Those pyruvates end up interacting with the oxygen and the mitochondria, and so they produce carbon dioxide, water, and 36 ATP. That carbon dioxide builds up in the cell in a high concentration, diffuses out of the cell from high to low concentration. It goes into the capillaries, and this CO2 goes back up towards the lungs to be exhaled. Okay, the whole process of why we do cellular respiration is to produce a high amount of usable energy in the form of ATP. Okay, now we don't need all that ATP right now. If we have extra glucose in the bloodstream, we can bring it in over here and store that extra glucose in muscle cells or liver cells in the form of something called glycogen. So what happens is we take those individual glucose molecules, we bring them in using insulin, and we polymerize the glucose into glycogen. And the way we do that is through dehydration synthesis. So there's an OH group hanging off this glucose, there's an OH group hanging off this glucose. If we rip this H off of this glucose and this OH off this glucose, we produce water, and we polymerize glucose into the form glycogen. We do that over and over again. That's dehydration synthesis. Okay? So this way we have glucose stored in a nice, neat, firmly packed manner inside muscle cells and liver cells to be used for a later day. Hey, now what happens is, for a later day, if our glucose levels in the bloodstream are low, we can then break apart the glycogen using hydrolysis. So we add water to glycogen, and we break it back down into its monomers. So this is hydrolysis of glycogen using the enzyme glucagon. So glucagon breaks apart glycogen into glucose, and then glucose can then leave the muscle cell or liver cell, get into the bloodstream, and get shipped throughout the body and be used by other cells to complete cellular respiration. It can also stay within this cell and end up over here to do cellular respiration.